Ella, thank you so much for joining me today on the What is a Good Life podcast. Having spoken with you a few times now, I'm very intrigued to see where this conversation goes today.
I am also intrigued to see where it goes. So I'm looking forward to it. Thanks for having me on.
So, as you're aware, the question that I kick this off with is there a question you're exploring as you move through life?
Yeah, and we just talked just before, and you said, do you have any questions for me before we start? And I kind of went, no, I don't need to prepare anything. And as you said that question, I thought to myself, is there a question I'm exploring at the moment? And I remember we have had a bit of a trial run of this podcast. You mentioned we've met a few times, and I can't remember what I said last time, which is probably okay. But musings I was having in the shower this morning. I'm not sure it's a question I'm constantly exploring, but something I've definitely had to unpick and explore for myself. And I can't remember why it came up in my head this morning as I was in the shower. But often that's where we have the most illuminating thoughts. And I was thinking about that throughout my life, I've struggled with always saying I know. So if someone tells me something, or if even if I don't know, I was like, yeah, I know. And the past 10 years or so, I've tried to consciously get a lot better about saying, I just not saying I know or saying I don't know, and learning, because I was reflecting, or I've often reflected on how I've missed out on things in my life by saying I know when I didn't really know. And there were opportunities for learning. And I'm sure that it probably opened a few doors for me, saying I know and being able to, I guess, flag that I did and get through. And I'm sure that it served me in a number of ways. But I also think about that I've missed out by having that reaction. And yeah, so it's not a question as much as something that I was reflecting on this morning, that is something that I've grappled with, or tried to consciously not do over the past 10 years or so.
Out of interest, when did you first kind of even realize that this was something that you might deem as I don't know, even problematic, or something that was maybe that could cost opportunities? What was the initial kind of dawning of that like?
Yeah, good question. I don't know that there was a dawning as such.
Look at you go.
I don't know exactly.
Look at this. You're just saying this is a fully embodied message here. Please carry on.
Stop. Yeah, I'm not sure that there was an actual dawning. I think that probably some people might have pointed it out to me at different points of time. I'm not sure that was helpful, but I don't know if that was the trigger, because along with my I know nature, I'm also like, I don't like to be told much about myself. I think that's human nature, and I'm being very honest. Hopefully I don't live to regret the honesty. But I've had to learn to take that on board more. So what was there an actual dawn? I think it was more example rather than, so as in when I witnessed others saying that they didn't know, I then was able to see the benefit and the opportunities for learning that brought. I think it's probably that.
It's such a strange dynamic that we've almost created, this idea that I'll go very wide here and just say, like, in a universe where, it's 95% dark energy and dark matter, and we literally do not know what that is, uh, the prevalence of our certainty or our knowing or our pretending to know is almost a little comical, if you get me.
Yeah,
With
for sure.
with regards to this, because I think this is such a prevalent and, as you say, kind of human thing. What do you think, out of interest, the sense of I know created or offered to you?
Mm. I think it um, sort of allowed me the confidence to walk through doors that I wasn't confident going through, maybe. Um, I think uh, I think that I I was always an ambitious person, and I think that I was secretly not feeling like I was allowed to be in some of the spaces that I was in, for whatever reason. So I think it was a lack of confidence masked by a confidence of knowing, which, as I say, I think it served me quite well in a lot of ways. Um, and the good thing is you can get to know even if you don't know straight away. So I think that in some ways it's been a useful tool. I think interestingly, maybe it's only been safe enough for me to explore not knowing in a more open way over the past decade or so, because I feel like I've arrived in enough confidence within the spaces that I occupy to be able to say, I don't know, and sit with that, and that's okay, and feel all right about that.
There's something kind of beautifully paradoxical to what you're pointing to, in the sense of, the I know, and this is what you're bringing here, but I think this is just so human. Like, I think most people who are listening could relate to this. But the fact that you say the I know kind of gave confidence when maybe there wasn't the confidence there, and then and I'm coming to this appreciate the same thing. I almost view real confidence as the willingness or the expression of I don't know. Do you know,
Yeah,
like, which is, it's almost like quite a curious contradiction in terms, almost.
yeah, yeah, for sure. Um, and it makes sense when you unpick, like when you break it down like this, it makes perfect sense. But yeah, it is totally also counterintuitive to what you might first think.
Just what is it when you mention there the sense of, being in rooms where, or being in situations where maybe you didn't think it was okay to not know, or there wasn't space to not know. How was that developed for you? Like, how was that experience of that comfort growing, or even just that feeling that it was okay to express this?
Yeah, I think it's uh, looking around and seeing, looking at the other people in those rooms and going, "Well, really?" Like, I think, I think that recognizing that we are. It always sounds so basic and so simple when you come down to these answers, because it's like you listen to 10 podcasts and everyone will say, it comes down to we're all human. It comes down to we're all grappling with the same things, and it's just like it feels really basic, but like it is also true that just looking around, going, well, I'm not sure they know either. I'm not sure they also know. And actually, um, let's learn together. Let's try some things out. Let's see where it takes us, and like actually grappling with the unknown is more exciting, and it frees you up to explore.
This is I almost think like one of the kind of incredible parts of life that we've somehow tried to mitigate or limit or remove even the sense that something is unknown. And yet for me, that definitely feels like that's a life force in itself. For you in your own experience of that, like what is that kind of coming to terms or grappling with the unknown or exploring in the unknown? Like how would you kind of have noted the difference in the quality of your experience when maybe embracing this more, I guess?
Hmm. Yeah, great question. Um, oh, it's scary, but scary is also exciting and just less boring. And I think that day-to-day living can get really routine and boring very quickly and very easily if you don't, especially if you're doing like a career and you're doing quite a lot of the same stuff routinely, albeit it for a different project or a different client or whatever. It's still quite similar, and so opening things up to the unknown opens up new possibilities, um, which include possibility of failure. But again, that then links to the next one, which is the other cliche I'll go to, which is let's all embrace failure and like actually that's where you learn and like all of that kind of stuff, which also is cliche but true and helpful in a lot of ways as well. So yeah, I think um, also interestingly though, in parallel to not knowing and embracing the unknown and embracing failure and all of that stuff, I am also someone I've learned through just living as myself for quite a long time, quite a few decades, um, that I am someone who also needs certain guardrails in place to be able to then um, be free. Like, which it took quite a long time again for me to learn that because I was just like, I'm so free and easy and flexible and like this is how I am and I am in a lot of ways, and I also find it easier to fully be free and flexible if I have certain levels of security or guardrails in place to enable me to do that. It's a bit like, it reminds me of like uh, the best, often the most creative solutions come from when you're having to work in really tight limitations,
Yeah.
because you have to get creative to work around those limitations. It's a bit like that as a metaphor, maybe for how I have to live my life, I've realized.
Yeah. And that was a wonderful impression of freedom and being so easy there as well. That was appreciated that. This is a lovely idea though, and something I think even in my own life that I don't know, I'm kind of playing with a little bit of my own process of even of creativity as well, of creativity within constraints. I heard someone talk recently about how a river needs banks to be a river. Without those constraints, it just wouldn't be a river, right? And there's constraints everywhere, but yet we almost have this notion that freedom is just or there's somehow this version of freedom that doesn't involve any constraints, or we could view them as obstacles to it.
Mm.
For you, what did you discover even for yourself around like what guardrails were necessary for you, or what felt helpful in your kind of sense of that?
Yeah, it's really prosaic and quite a boring answer, I'm sure, Mark, but it's the truth, so I will say it. So, so for me, I uh, grew up with a bit of precarious financial security. Um, my parents were great at following their passions and living and pursuing their art and things. But that meant that it was always like slightly not sure on the old finances. And so, for example, if I give an example of what that has played out for me, like when I was a big research agency, I was about to go on to maternity leave, and I knew for a fact I did not want to go back to that job afterwards. But I knew that the job would allow me to secure a mortgage on my first flat. So I wanted to make sure I got the mortgage and then left my job. so so it kind of is a bit counterintuitive, because most people want to make sure they can pay their mortgage once they get it. But I was like, no, I just need to get it, and then I'm good to do my own thing, and I'm sure it'll be fine. And touch wood, luckily, it has been fine. But I think that's sort of a concrete example of, I guess, what I'm describing.
And what do you? I always love the example of children, or maybe even other life choices that don't necessarily lead to more pragmatism. Um, and I've experienced something similar too in having a daughter for the last almost 2 years, in terms of just how I approach life, and it not necessarily leading to more careful choices, if necessarily careful choices. But just from your perspective, what do you think contributed to, okay, I've got a mortgage now, and I'm going on maternity leave, and now I'll leave the job. What do you sense allowed such a step in the context of what could be considered another situation where you might go, oh well, now I really have to hold on to this.
Yeah. Well, I think like having a child is like it's a big, again, I feel really like it's such a sort of normal prosaic answer, but it is a game changer, and like things change when you have kids. Like and for a woman, like your entire body and like you literally become a new person. So there's that, which probably contributed. But I think it's about also, well, there was something practical about it. My job was in London in a full-time office, and I bought a flat in Oxford, which is where my family are based. So I didn't want to commute, and I didn't want to be away from the baby for like, it just was illogical to me. That just made no sense at all, and it was just not something I was going to accept. And yeah, I think also like setting an example. Well, it's about the priorities, right? So I for me, and everyone has their own perspectives on this, and that's okay. So no judgment in what I'm about to say here. But for me, being a good parent meant being present, as much as I could be, and not enough that we weren't going to drive each other crazy. As my child gets older, he kind of wants me less present at times, I would say. So you want to get the balance right, but being available to be present, um, if they do want you and need you, and enough to provide that that connection, because you are everything to a child when they're, particularly when they're very young, but also as they get older. Um, so yeah, so I think that gave me the, yeah, that extra level of responsibility. Again, gave me the freedom to shirk responsibility in a way. Again, very counterintuitive, but also does make sense when you think about it.
Yeah, this resonates deeply with my own experience, and ahead of time, I would have assumed that I was going to be even more deliberate with work and providing stuff, almost, or providing security in that sense. But that didn't occur for me at all. There's something just about you said there about the priorities. For you, what's that like? How did you come to that? Like for me, I think there's been a wider appreciation that there's very little I can give to the important relationships in my life that's more important than presence and attention. And when I see the effect on that of the people in my life, it's very hard to sense that they're not flourishing in that presence and attention. Which I don't know about you, but that takes even less pressure off me or more pressure off me to go and provide more stuff because I'm seeing the consequence of the presence and attention. Just curious from your perspective how you kind of sense that or sense whatever you sensed, even if it's not exactly how I'm putting it, but like what allowed you almost to see that, I guess.
Yeah. So absolutely agree. And it's a constant battle to be as present and give as much
Yeah.
attention as I would like to give. Because even though I now don't have a job in an office, I run a business, and sometimes that can be all consuming. So trying to balance that and to be very present and not checking emails at the same time. And, I'm not always successful at that. It's not
Yeah.
always possible. Um, and there's a difference between physically being there with your child and being present and attentive. They're not the same thing. And so getting that balance is not always, it's hard. It's hard to do. um how did I get there? So I mean, so again, coming back to my parents, I had some good role models in that sense, in that my dad, my mum stopped working because she had a mental health breakdown when I was about 5 years old. But my dad gave up his office job that he did originally have to become a busker when I was 7 or 8. And then income dropped, but suddenly they were very present, much more present than they had been before. And so there was some fundamental life lessons from my parents and from growing up that I just instinctively were inbuilt inside of me. So I would love to say that it all was down to me just having like this big realization, but the truth is, like, I had some quite good role modeling in that. And so I always, um, although I was ambitious and although I spent a lot of time working and grinding, and still do spend a lot of time doing those things, I've always known that there's a different way, and I've always known and valued the importance of that different way. And so I slowly, and they say you become your parents, don't they? I mean, uh, we'll see. But I'm sort of slowly kind of like making, throughout the different moves that is sort of leading me more towards those directions.
Just out of interest, when you say it there, what was that? And I know it happened in your childhood, so I'm not saying that this is just something that's still fresh or that you remember it, but so clearly. But the sense of parents being around more, even in the context of income dropping, what effect did that have? Like, or what impression did that leave?
Yeah, good question. So
Thank you.
yeah, it's hard. No problem. It's hard to remember,
Yeah.
honestly, like what that was like. But I do, interestingly, have footage of me as an 8-year-old, because there was a documentary made about my dad at the time, because people thought he was nuts because he left. He was working in health. He was doing a lot around. What was he doing? He was doing health promotion, and he did a lot of work around HIV and AIDS. And he was working at the council, just like the Oxford City Council, doing health promotion there, and it was quite a well paid job. And he just left it to become a busker, literally. And so that got a bit of attention. This documentary was made, and then I think it was, what's that morning TV show in the UK? Not Good
this
morning,
morning?
Brit. This morning.
Okay.
So there was a slot on this morning where I'm there as an 8-year-old, and they're like, "What do you think about your dad just leaving his job?" And I'm like, "Oh, it means I'll get to like see him a bit more, and I'll get to." And I was, and so I mean, I think I don't know, like I can kind of pinpoint that moment via footage, and I think what that did, it wasn't just the time, it was a role modeling of what that meant. So so this was when CDs were a thing. So my dad would sell CDs of his flute music. Like he hooked up his flute to his guitar pedals and made this ambient flute music. And they would travel around different cities selling CDs. He always made more money when I was sat there with him as a child. That was a good little marketing ploy. But they also did house swaps. So they did house swap. When I was 14, they went to Australia for 6 months, and they were like, "Come on, Ella," and I was like, "Oh no, I got GCSEs to do." Um, I'm a bit busy. So I stayed with my nan, and then we went out for 6 weeks and met them. But they also did house swaps to various other places. So what it did is it just showed me that there's different ways to live, and you might not be living a really flash lifestyle with a lot of money, and it might be slightly precarious at times, but there is a different way, and there's different values. And my mum was always really good at this, and I mentioned she had a breakdown when I was quite young, and she'd been a social worker, and she just had I guess now there would be more official terms for what it was, but back then in the 80s, I don't think there was like much understanding. And they just said, "Oh, she got a bit burnt out. She got burnt out," and she
Right.
was and but she. I remember being stressed about exams and things at university, and she's like, "Don't do them."
Right.
Like, what? What are you on about? And she's like, "It doesn't matter. Do something else. It's fine." I'm like, no, that's outrageous. So, like, in a way, it served helpfully. At the time, I probably thought it was a bit of an anti-role model in that it helped me. Like, I was like, "Shut up, mum,"
Yeah.
and like made sure I did them. So I don't think that was her intention. Though I think she was literally saying, don't do it. Just if it doesn't make you, if you're not happy, don't do this thing. Which I found very difficult to accept or hear. And I still find it quite hard. I still struggle with that sentiment, but I respect it and I get it. And yeah.
Geez, I must say, given a lot of the views I hold at this stage in life, I'm quite enamored by them.
Yeah.
Uh, there's something I don't know. It speaks to a lot to where I am presently in life in terms of going back to the idea that I think attention is the most important thing that we can give each other. And, it's not, I know I live in an economic reality, but, I've mentioned to you before, I stepped away from finance, where they're a bit like your father would have experienced a big drop off in income, especially initially. And while I feel I'm building something, there's definitely moments where I'm like, interesting that I feel okay in this scenario versus maybe the idea or the expectations that I would have had for life at other points.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but there's also like a freedom in my time and in my day, which I find like not that I don't work hard in what I'm doing, but there's a flexibility of my time that I almost think like if I don't care about certain things and if I'm not dominated by the idea that I have to provide something else before I can enjoy life. I think there is, you mentioned the idea of being free or feeling some more freedom in life. Um, I think, and I'm not downplaying, someone who's in like really struggling to pay the rent every month and life is in like really difficult with multiple jobs. I'm just saying for a large other strata of life or people, I don't think I think we have far more freedom than we'd ever imagine. And it's just with the subtlety of how your parents are approaching things there that a lot of the things that have us trapped are not actually as real as we think they are.
Yeah. And like, that's the ultimate, for me, that's the ultimate, like having autonomy over my
Yeah,
time and my day and how it plays out. Like, I don't, I think I'm unemployable at this point. I don't think I could ever really be like work for somebody again. I just don't think it's possible because I just couldn't, like, to me, that's the ultimate, um, yeah, like that choice and that freedom. I yeah, and I think, like you say, like yeah, there are people who they just don't have the luxury to be able to say that, and I know a lot of them. I'm related to a lot of them, um, and so hearing a conversation like this would be difficult, understandably, but also there are um, a lot of constraints and blocks in our own minds, and um, we all need to take a holiday from ourselves quite a lot to
yeah,
be able to sort of like see outside of of what we think is reality.
yeah, and yeah. I think this is a really interesting inquiry, like of just I don't know, to even ask ourselves why are we working or why are we looking to provide that in particular, whatever it may be. And I think this culture is so powerful. Like there's messaging everywhere. Like I've mentioned before on this, I don't even walk around with a phone these days, but I still see billboards, or if I'm watching something on YouTube, an ad will pop up. Like whatever it is, like the messaging is so constant that life has to be one particular way, that I think it puts a huge burden or stress on people from all walks of life to provide some sense of what we think is maybe fundamental to a good life. But I'm experiencing more and more in my own life that I, and this is just my preference too, I guess, but that it doesn't seem anywhere near as fundamental as we think.
Yeah, we're um, a passive audience for selling shit to, essentially, and like I do quite a lot of research about selling shit to people as well, and like uh, I do.
Eloquently described.
I do.
Yeah.
So I do that, and I also do other research which is less commercial too, and more social. I do a mix, but yeah, it's like it's unavoidable. It's really difficult to gain perspective when we've got this constantly. We've got, as you say, just billboards. Like turn on the computer, there's going to be ads popping at you everywhere. Like of course, um in a culture of sort of comparison as well, where everyone's their own personal brand and they're all you know living these particular ways. Like yeah, it's very difficult. And I don't know, I had great ambitions when I had my son to not let him look at screens, and which I failed at, and like he really likes YouTube a lot. And you see it from an early age, him and his cousins and his friends, and you're just thinking, oh god, like I'm failing as a parent because I'm exposing it. But like also it's so hard to um move, to be able to move away from that. So I'm not sure where I was going with that point, but I've just sort of talked it.
Just out of interest, though, the given you said your beautiful tagline for what you do there, um, what is what when you're exploring, what attracted you to even some of the more social aspects of that research that you alluded to, and maybe even in the context of some of what we're describing or discussing in this conversation?
Yeah, so I um, social research is where I started, I would have been horrified to think that I was doing commercial research when I was younger. But the realities are that actually it's, well, so it's been a journey basically is what I would say. So I knew I liked speaking to people, and I knew I cared about unfairness in the world because I could see there was a lot of unfairness, and I understand sort of like societal structures and inequality from a very early age. And I studied sociology, and I went to university and did sociology, read sociology at university. I didn't know that there was an entire industry of research and market research. But luckily, there was a careers advisor at my university who went, oh, they do graduate schemes and stuff. So I was like, oh, cool. Check that out. Unsuccessfully applied to graduate schemes because my quantitative skills were non-existent. But I managed to, basically, I kept bothering Ipsos, which is a big research agency, for a few months, and kept writing to them saying, I'm really disappointed I didn't get into your graduate scheme. Like, what's going on? Let me in. And eventually they were like, oh, come and come and do this like assistant role, like the lowest like role that they could offer me. And I went in and then just found the qualitative team and just kept bothering them until they eventually sort of all right then, and then I did successfully apply internally for the graduate scheme, but I still can't do quant research, but my agency does because other people I work with do lots of really great quant work, but not me personally. I still am definitely a qualitative researcher, but I started off in the social research institute in Ipsos, as it was back then, a long time ago, and I was working on massive projects for central government, things like the 10-year drug strategy. I'd done my dissertation about crack cocaine because I'd seen a bit of that and how it was impacting communities that I lived in, and so that so I did a lot of that kind of work. I was doing a lot of stuff about child poverty, doing a lot of work about just really social issues essentially, and so that's how I started, and I still do a lot of work around those issues, and I often do work with lesser heard people that are not listened to as much typically, who have been historically marginalized often. So yeah, a lot of my work is around that. But while I was at Ipsos in the Social Research Institute, a lady came over from Ogilvy, New York, Johanna Shapira. Shout out to Johanna. She was an expert in film ethnography, and she had set up a film ethnography team in Ogilvy, and she moved over to London. She got headhunted to Ipsos, and so she came in and she chose a few of us from the qual team to start an film ethnography team there, and essentially within the business it wasn't grown. They saw the potential for it to grow within the marketing side of the business, much more lucrative essentially to grow in the marketing side of the business. So we still did social research, but that's when I did a crossover into marketing, and it was fascinating. I mean, you mentioned you got a background in finance. I've done a lot of work in financial services and really interesting projects, but also with links often to the social side. So, for example, I did a huge piece of work about underserved and unbanked people all around Europe, and what that meant and what that looks like, and but also, groups for new product development, and it's fascinating, and I've managed to sort of I just think I managed to move away from sort of the moral judgment of it's bad to do commercial research, because while there can be negative consequences for the commercialization and productization of things, as a discipline, it's really essentially you're still just meeting people and
Mm.
understanding their lives, and the opportunity to do that within whatever the structure is, I think, is still what drives my passion for the work that I do. And it's a really privileged position to get to meet people and for them to invite you into their lives and tell you all sorts of things, and show you all sorts of things that often completely unrelated to the question at hand, but actually when you're looking at things as a whole, all of that context is where that product or service or whatever fits, and all of that richness is fascinating.
When did you start to get to appreciate that kind of under, like, that richness that may seem almost tangential, or that you ask a question and I've had many experiences even through the course of this project, asking one question and it just going absolutely anywhere, particularly in the private interviews as well, when I do this with a corporate team, or when I'm doing one-on-one interviews, or when I did the initial 120 interviews. What do you sense is occurring almost for people when you can just, maybe ask something that seems a little innocuous, and it could really reveal something, as you said, that may not seem connected, and yet there's some perspective, just the way you described that there. There's obviously a clearer perspective where you're capable of standing back and viewing this from to see the connectedness of it. Yeah. I hope that hasn't been too vague, but when did you start to develop that sense of it matters what they're saying, no matter almost what it is they're saying?
Yeah, I think being trained in anthropology and ethnography is really helpful for that, because you're very much looking at the broader context of people's lives and going, well, it's not a vacuum. Like, yeah, you want
Yeah,
to talk about, I don't know, you want to talk about, I don't want to say a product because, but you want to talk about this particular product or
yeah,
whatever, and, but actually, like that does not, it does not sit alone, and all these other things that are happening for people. And by the way, most of the time they don't really care about your product or brand or service. Like, that's not taking up like all the space in their mind, even though
yeah.
you've got like 30 people who've really like thought about every single articulation of what this looks like, and but like actually that they're like living their lives. It comes back to that basic truth that we were talking about earlier, the really boring prosaic ones that are nonetheless true. Like, they're just humans living their lives. What they care about is they care about their kids, they care about their job that they might lose, they care about their sick mum, they care about all these things that they've got to go in, their bill that's coming out next week, and they're not sure if they're gonna get charged because they're gonna miss the payment, or like, there's so much other stuff happening for people all the time, and you're there going, tell me about this fizzy drink that you like, like and that's why I love ethnography as a methodology, although albeit commercial ethnography, which is more like a day that you spend with people rather than years as you would in the academic sense, but because it gives you have the room to just breathe and be with people in their own environments, and if done correctly, it should be participant led. Yes, you have some key things that you want to observe or do with people, but actually, show me your world. What are we doing today? Let's hang out. What's going on? And then once you grasp what that world looks and feels like, well, then you can start to make sense of where that product or service sits or misaligns, or whatever.
Just when you mentioned some of the social aspects of this too, in terms of even for your dissertation, exploring crack or cocaine in various places or jurisdictions. Like, what's you mentioned before too to me, just around the significance of you, and you just said it here as well, the unheard or voices that aren't being listened to. Can you describe to me just what the driver is in that, and the significance of that within research, and why that is so significant for you to try to bring more voices into that research?
It's about things being unfair and unjust. I think it's probably the underlying driver of why that's so important to me, and that products and services, whether, and that might be healthcare services, that might be fundamental things or policies that governments are making that have a huge impact on people's lives and opportunities. If you're not speaking to the people who it actually is going to be affecting, what's the point of it's just meaningless. The work is meaningless. The policy is meaningless, because you need to know what that actually means, and connect up with whether that's a minister in Whitehall who's has no idea, frankly, what it's like to be a single mum living on a council estate, and partner's a crack addict, or whatever it might be. They're so far removed from that. How can you possibly hope to make policy that is that's gonna really impact people like this, when you have no idea what that looks like, or how that's going to be received, or how that might make a difference, or you're just going to make bad decisions. And that's the same for business as well. If you don't understand the people that are buying your products, you're going to make very bad decisions about the work, because you just don't know what you don't know. And so that's I guess what drives, or has always historically driven, why I do that work. But there's another element to this as well, which I'm also quite passionate about and involved quite heavily in, which is about actually making the research industry itself more reflective of the communities that we are trying to research and engage with. Because also, all research is biased. There's a bit of a lie that's existed for many years about research being objective. And yes, there's a need to try and keep some level of objectivity if you can. But the reality is, again, we're all human and everything we do is subjective. And so if the people who are conducting the research are not reflective of the people that they are researching, there's going to be endemic biases. There's going to be, things are going to go badly wrong. And again, the quality of what's then coming back to people who are making decisions, whether that's a brand manager, a product designer, or a policy maker, is going to be not what it should be. And you're not going to be creating services that are appropriate, and you're not going to be making as much profit as you could make. So yeah.
But there's something that sounds, particularly on the policy level, though, there's something that sounds so disturbing about, and I'd love to know even the evolution of it from your perspective or how you see it. But the idea that somebody, a minister or a team that have never lived that life, that have no experience of it, I don't know, do they reference some research done by somebody else, or do they just use their own, like historically, have people just used their own assumptions as to?
No, I mean, research has been done for a long time,
Yeah,
but that's why I think it's really important who's doing the research and
yeah,
how, because the quality of what comes back, and the reality of what comes back is what's important. So if your survey has been designed by someone who also has no lived experience of the thing that you are researching, for example, you're going to be asking questions that might not be the right questions, and you're going to be analyzing in a way that maybe you don't understand how to properly look at the data that you're getting back, or you're going to go in and you're going to if it's a qualitative project, you might be going in with a lot of assumptions, and again, design every step of the research process is subjective, from the way that you're asking questions, how you're going in, all of these things can be deeply problematic, and even the roots of research and anthropology and have been quite dark, imperialist, like very Western, like extractive roots, and it's hugely problematic. And so like people, there's a lot of people now, I'm glad to say, starting to do this work of being more reflective and reflexive, and recognizing, and rather than being extractive, going in and working with communities and saying, how, like, do you actually even care about this issue that we're trying to research, first of all? Like, is this, and half the time they're going to go, no, we want to tell you about this. You
Yeah.
go, huh, okay, cool, that seems probably much more important. That's what you want to tell us about. And okay, and how do you want us to, like, how should we be asking these questions? How should, and by the way, maybe should we train you up, and you can ask some of these questions? Maybe you're better placed to do this than I am, because I'm not from, so there's just so many questions to ask, and so many things to think about and reframe.
Well, but that's, I think I didn't articulate what I had intended to say correctly before, but that leads me to the same kind of place, what you just described there, of like, that seems staggeringly problematic. That, you know, if I'm going in with my assumptions of how other people live, if I'm going into this experience through the lens of a prevailing culture that's quite extractive, that's probably having heavy judgment of something that isn't maybe in accordance with the way that I see life. Like, from the point of view of creating effective policy for people, or actually serving people, that seems like it could be even more of a judgment of what people ought to be, rather than how can I help you from where you are.
Yeah,
Which is, I don't know, that's something that there's quite an uneasy feeling in me around the
yeah,
implications of what this occurring for a very long time may have caused.
yeah, yeah. It's it's deeply problematic, um, and yeah, practices need to change, and hopefully are starting to change. And there is a lot more. I'm seeing a lot more um, people referencing things like lived experience, and bringing lived experience into the heart of what they do. The slight pushback or issue, I guess, with that is that it's hard.
Yeah.
It takes a long time. It takes more money. It takes, really, you've got to have the right people in place. You've got to make those links, and you end up in a completely different place usually than where the client might have hoped to or intended a project to go, because if you're doing it correctly, you're giving over the power to the people that you are researching, engaging with, and they will take it rightly in the direction that they want to take it, and that can be tension around that.
But there's some real parallels with what you're saying, even some of the work that I'm involved in at the moment, in terms of, people love to try to understand humans almost from psychological studies, which, you can even talk about that acronym that Heinrich came up around: weird, Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic countries. Um, where it's done from a very particular lens or a very particular point of view. But even that aside, the idea that I could understand you through research that's done generically on a wider body of people, I think we're really seeing limitations to this. And while it's still very comforting for people to rely on that research, to almost getting back to the start of this conversation and saying, I know, when I really don't know. I think we're starting to see maybe it's a hopeful idea that I have, but I do think that we're starting to see the lack of efficacy in approaching things this way. And even in the process that you described there, in the acknowledging that it's hard, well, that would be quite a helpful thing to understand about humans. It's hard to understand the human, even the people sometimes closest to it, if given a particular moment. Um, I think there's something about that trajectory that gives me optimism in terms of the greater understanding we could have for people, or the greater empathy we could have for people, or just going back, as I say to the start, the greater acknowledgement of, oh, I simply don't know.
Yeah, agreed. And it would be great to sort of end on a hopeful, hopeful note on this, because yeah, it could get quite depressing quite quickly otherwise. But yeah, I think there's loads of opportunity and space in that as a concept.
Yeah.
And yeah, again, it's the embracing the I don't know, and it could be really exciting about where it takes you, and you end up in completely different places and handing over the power and going, what are we doing? How are we going to do this? Like, that's terrifying. And also you're thinking, going back to those constraints, budget, time, like, but like, if you want to do real worthwhile work, then you got to do it.
I think as well to acknowledge the optimism that I have within this as well of, I think that's a lovely metaphor for life as well, though. Like, you can set up a project, you can, I'm thinking of my own work too. I can create a container for a conversation or whatever. But when that feels most alive, there's a handing over of, uh, there's a restricting of my own attempts to control something, or there's a pulling back. And I often find that that's where the most meaningful things happen, rather than agreeing on a predetermined point that I'm going to quickly race people through and getting there and saying that these are our key takeaways, or something to that effect.
Yeah.
I think there's a really lovely kind of analogy for life in what you're suggesting there, even in terms of what you said earlier, in terms of, okay, there can be some handrails, but this is almost where there's a freedom too, like within that.
Mm. Yeah.
Just one question I did want to ask you, and before I maybe touch on the final question, but I really wanted to ask you at the time, and it moved in a different direction. But from your perspective, what was that like? Even when you were mentioning having exams when you were 14, or even when you were doing exams in university, and your mum just saying, "Oh, you don't have to do them," and then you're talking about these ambitions that you would have always felt as a person too. What was that experience like? In You'd almost think it might be the inverse. Just from your perspective, what was that like growing up in that kind of
Yeah. I
circumstance?
got angry. I got annoyed. It's like, what are you don't understand. Like, what are you on about? What do you mean don't do them? Like, what? And in a way, maybe it was like helpful in that actually that spurred me on to push through and be like, fuck you, like, what are you
Yeah.
about? Of course I have to do this. But at the same time, as I say, a useful lesson that there is another way to think about it, even though I'm wedded to this is, what I'm going to be doing, and I need this, and this is what I want it to be doing in order to sort of move to that, that perceived next step, or like, pathway in my life. Um, yeah, it pissed me off.
But I love, throughout the course of the conversation, just like it seems like there's so many kind of lovely shifts in your perspective. Initially it pissed me off. Now I can see it from this perspective too. Starting off with I letting go of that notion of I know, um, you know, notions as well of like realizing that where true confidence may exist in the I don't know versus the safety that I know can provide us. You know, stepping away from a full-time job or a job for somebody else when just securing a mortgage. A lovely, I love, and it's something maybe I'd like to explore with you another time. Just the idea of constraints and freedom. I think that's a really beautiful concept, and however we think of freedom in our own lives. The example that your parents offered you in terms of your father stepping away, the values of time with people, of attention, and this also then just even with your work, the kind of the lovely sense of whether it's for the social stuff or commercially, the sense of, how do I see people, how do I get see that people are more fully heard, an acknowledgement of even of our own biases, and the structural and the implications of that too, but I guess just an awareness of our own implicit perceptions or assumptions that we're making for anyone. And you're just really, really curious, Ella, to ask you the question of what is a good life for you?
Um, I think a good life is sort of an amalgamation of all those things that we've touched upon there, and I think it's it's freedom. It's having the autonomy to decide what's going to make me happy today, and I'm gonna be able to do that, even if I can't do it the whole day. Um, well, there's some compromises in that, and I might have to do some emails, and I might have to do a couple of calls, but I will go for a 2-hour walk around the nature reserve because that's going to make me really happy today, and I know that I'm going to feel good about that, or I'm gonna, whatever it might be, but just having the freedom to be able to make those choices. To me, that's what a good life is.
It's much like a lot of things you've been saying in this conversation that resonates very deeply with me. And I don't know, there's a lovely intention behind that, I think, and a simplicity to it, as as much of what you've been saying in this conversation too. It doesn't seem. I often think that a good life doesn't seem as complicated as we make it. It may not be. It may be more simple than we think. That doesn't mean it's easy within the construct of this life and everything else we've been touching on. But yeah, that resonates deeply with me. Ella, look, I've really enjoyed speaking with you again. I've really enjoyed so many of the different threads or the inquiries that you've shared with us. So thank you very much for joining us on the What is a Good Life podcast today.
Thanks for having me.